Survival in a lawless world. My name is Fabrizio Tassinari. For those of you who don't know me, I'm the executive director here at the school. Before introducing our main speaker, just a couple of words to situate today's event. The event was actually originally conceived as a lecture that is part of a specialization master seminar that I co-convened here at the SPG with Lajcák, whom I think either has joined us or will join us online. Now there's a few people there, so it's hard to tell. But the point is, both the lecture and its title actually predated the events that have followed since Russia's invasion of Ukraine. I'm afraid that the overall theme is uncannily relevant. Therefore, we decided to keep the title, to keep the theme, but to open it up. So the lecture, there is really glad to see our students and those that regularly attend the class, as well as many others from the EUI community and the broader public. To all of you, welcome. And I guess the fact that so many of you have joined us is, if anything, an indication of the fact that so many of us are trying to make sense, really, or some sense to what is happening. And this is perhaps what we should try to focus on today. On to our main speaker. On my right is Robert Cooper, who is a senior British diplomat, seasoned as well, known to many of you, I think for particularly working in EU institutions for many years, with two high representatives, Javier Solana and Cathy Ashton. Over the years, this work has led you to really have a front row seat on many of the dossiers that have been crucial for European foreign and security policy, from the Iran deal to the European security strategy, which we discussed a few days ago. Just a couple of days ago, you had a session with our students on the Serbia-Kosovo negotiation. And last but not least, you have, some of this experience has led you to publish some piece of writings that have been rather accomplished, in my opinion, at least. And so we thought it would make sense to have you also as an adjunct professor of the school, and I'm very, very happy that you have joined us. Now, before giving you the floor, Robert, just to say in really 2 sentences that there are, of course, several directions and angles in which today's conversation could and should go. I think together with Robert, we have thought it relevant and really to stick rather literally to the topic of the title that suggests survival, and to try to, if possible, move the needle of the conversation to what the ultimate outlook of even a ceasefire, an armistice, peace settlement, if anything, might look like. We will start with an introduction by you, and then we open it up to some of our guests online. Without further ado, thank you.
Thank you very much, Fabrizio. I'm not going to answer the question. I'm going to talk about what strike me as being the most important facts in the question. I think that all theory should be based on facts. So I start by talking about the facts, by talking about what's happening and why it's happening. If you want to know why it's happening, the best guide, because after all, this is what's going on, has been started and has been carried on by Russia above all. So the best way to answer the question why is to listen to Mr. Putin. And I'm going to read you 2 or 3 paragraphs from Mr. Putin's statement. He says, about the situation in the Donbass, we see that the forces that carried out a coup in 2014 seized power and are holding it through sham electoral procedures, have given up on the peaceful settlement of the conflict. For 8 years, 8 long years, we have done everything possible to resolve the situation by peaceful political means. All was in vain. It is simply not possible to stand all this anymore. It is necessary immediately to stop this nightmare. The genocide against millions of people living there, talking about Donbass, I guess, who rely on Russia, only on us. Their aspirations, the feelings of pain of these people, are the main motivation for us to take the decision to recognize People's Republics of the Donbass. I pause for a second here to say that somewhere around, it was 2050, I actually visited the Donbass with the OSCE monitors. This is a kind of wasteland. I have photographs on my camera, actually, of the ruins of the Donetsk airport. The government established there by the Russians. These consist of people who, I don't know where they came from, but you just have to meet them to realize that, honestly speaking, they are of no consequence. I don't know why they were chosen by the Russians. They found them on the street. What I think is important to emphasize further is that the leading NATO countries, in order to achieve their own goals, support extremist nationalists and neo-Nazis, who in turn will never forgive the Crimea and Sevastopol residents for choosing reunification with Russia. Well, actually, it's worth saying a word about Crimea. There have been 2 referendums on Crimea. There was one in 1991, when Ukraine separated from Russia, in which the numbers were good enough for a referendum. They were not overwhelming, but something like 56%, I think, those who voted for Crimea to be in Ukraine, because there was a kind of choice of being in Ukraine or being in Russia, or I guess being independent. When Ukraine declared itself independent from Russia, 56% of the people in Ukraine voted, of the people in Crimea voted to stay in Ukraine. There was then this was a referendum which was supervised by the Council of Europe and the OSCE. Then there was a referendum that was held following the Russian takeover, and that produced a very different result, but that wasn't supervised by anybody. And that produced a turnout of 82%, which people found under the circumstances scarcely credible. Mr. Putin goes on to say, they, of course, will crawl into Crimea, just like in the Donbass, in order to kill, just like the gangs of Ukrainian nationalists Hitler's accomplished, as they killed defenseless people in Crimea. They openly lay claim to a number of Russian territories. It's true that there were Ukrainian fascists as well as German fascists, and they were quite considerable in their numbers. It's also true that Stalin did a deal with Hitler to divide up the countries of Northern Europe. So there were many different forms of collaboration. The course of events, the incoming intimation, this is still Putin speaking, show that Russia's clash with these forces is inevitable. It is only a matter of time. They're getting ready, they're waiting for the right time. Now, they also claim to acquire nuclear weapons. Well, then if we want to talk about nuclear weapons, we ought to look to the Budapest Memorandum. When Ukraine became independent, or after Ukraine became independent in 1991, there was an agreement with Ukraine on the one side, and on the other side, US, UK, Russia, and then France joined later, the Budapest Memorandum, in which all of those said, you give up your nuclear weapons, and in return, we will guarantee your territorial integrity. Well, that doesn't seem to be what Russia is doing. And then, but I also actually underline the word crawl. They, of course, will crawl into Crimea. It seems to me that there is some sort of hint there that the people you're talking about are not people. They won't walk into Crimea. These are something less than people. And then he goes on to say, in accordance with Article 51 of the UN Charter, that's defense, I decided to launch a military operation. Its goal is to protect people who've been subjected to abuse and genocide by the regime in Kyiv for 80 years. For 8 years, let's say since 2014. And for this, we will pursue demilitarization and denazification of Ukraine, as well as bringing to justice those who have committed numerous crimes. Well, all I can say is that although there has been some history of right-wing extremism in this country, if you go back to World War II in Ukraine, there is no evidence at all of it now, not in the little country. I must say, I think that Mr. Zelensky has now established himself as probably the most respected political leader in Europe. Certainly not the leader. So that's Mr. Putin's view. To be honest, it's all garbage. Then I want to say a couple of things about, you can say, mistakes that we made. The first one is the well-known one, which is the Bucharest NATO, the conclusions of the Bucharest summit, in which NATO says Ukraine will become a member of NATO, or will be a member of NATO. It doesn't say when, it doesn't say how. And strangely, having said that Ukraine is going to be a member, it then doesn't do anything to make it happen. It was, after all, it is after all a NATO program membership action. If you want to have somebody as a member, we start working on the path with the NATO, with a membership action plan. And that starts the process of them working out what they need to do to become a member. But NATO has never gone anywhere near the NATO membership action plan for Ukraine. It just announced that Ukraine will be a member. It doesn't say when, it doesn't say how. Actually, that's ridiculous. You take all of the risks of proposing Ukraine for membership without giving it the security that membership gives. You ask yourself, how can you be so stupid? Well, one answer is that collective organization can sometimes be more stupid than single people. Because you've got one group of people who says, yes, and another group of people who said no. So you try to merge them and say yo or ness or something like this, and it doesn't make any sense. What actually happened at this NATO meeting was there was a strong disagreement by France as well. They thought this was not the right time and not the right way to approach this question. And there was a strong support for the idea from the USA. And I have no idea what position the UK took. I think we should have given with France and Germany. And then, having tried at great length to find some kind of compromise that we would accept, they said to the officials, you people are useless. We're going to do this on our own. And the heads of government, maybe with the foreign ministers, got together and produced these conclusions. This is a mistake. It's not that heads of government are stupid. They're not. They're always very clever people. But it's a bad one. But if they make a decision, nobody can question it because they're in charge. If you get, normally you send the senior officials out or the junior officials out. If the junior officials go out, they reach an agreement, the senior officials can look at it and say, no, this is wrong, let's change it. And then we give it to the heads of government, and the heads of government can then look at it again. You never get things right the first time. But if you give the task to the heads of government, then whatever comes out of it is done, it's finished. Nobody can guess it. And that's how this was done. So the answer is, if any of you ever become senior officials, never let your head of government do anything. Please don't let them get together and agree something. It's much better for you to agree it, and they can tell you it's all nonsense and improve it. I personally, myself, don't think that I ever get anything right first time. Every time I think that I've rewritten more things than I've written. At any rate, personally, I don't get them right first time. You put a group together, it's more difficult. You're very likely not to get it right. So the lesson from that is don't let the heads of government make decisions on their own. Let them make the decisions, but on the basis of some thorough examination and discussion of officials. A bit louder, sorry, okay. Then the second thing that we should look at in our not really our history, but the second thing we need to look at that has been done very badly by the international community is what are called the Minsk agreements. Actually, there was Minsk I and Minsk II. Well, I never looked at Minsk I because that's been superseded by Minsk II. I can tell Minsk II is very short. It's about on one side of a piece of paper. Maybe some of you have looked at it. I looked at it for hours and hours and hours, and I couldn't understand it. And my conclusion, and I looked at it fairly recently to remind myself, but when I was a little bit involved in Ukraine in 2015, I tried to understand this and reached the conclusion that it didn't make any sense at all. That it actually was, it was not possible to understand. So that's your guide to, everybody keeps saying, we must go back to the Minsk agreement. Well, I would say go back to the Minsk agreement and tear it up and start again. Because this wasn't really an agreement. This is nonsense. There is no substance that has been agreed. I understand people, I understand how this happened late at night. As a matter of fact, with heads of government. Because everyone was desperate to get some kind of ceasefire, some kind of basis, they'd probably be talking for, who knows, 14, 15 hours or something like this. At that point, you agree whatever anybody can agree, even if it's nonsense. And that's what happened with the Minsk agreement. But it's not a solution to keep going, to say, we must go back to what we agreed at Minsk. Well, actually, they didn't really agree anything at Minsk. So, in a way, we have two stories of failed negotiation, both within NATO. In fact, it didn't instruct Russia to invade Ukraine, but it certainly gave them a motive to. And then this second example of really bad diplomacy, I'm afraid to say also by heads of government. The other failure, the other thing that's wrong with Minsk is the structure of it, because it gives Russia a role as a mediator. Well, actually, Russia is a party to the conflict, but having one of the parties to the conflict as a mediator is not a very good idea unless you're Russian. So that's another failure. So I can't tell you what the answer is, but I can tell you what the mistake is. So there we are. That doesn't answer the question about surviving in a lawless world. It tells you how not to survive in a lawless world.
Thanks so much, Robert. I thought this at least gets us started for a conversation, and we have now quite some time for it. We then open up for comments and questions. I have already two on my list, and I know probably in the interest of time, Alex should come first because he will probably need to leave earlier, and after that, Teona perhaps can intervene just after. But Alex, please, the floor is yours.
Sure. Thanks a lot, Fabrizio, and thanks a lot, Robert, for setting the scene. By the way, we need to get the sound a little bit better in Buontalenti because when you're here online, you realize that it's not that good. Hey, listen, I think my value added will be here to just set the scene from a previous conflict which had similar elements to it. In other words, the war in Georgia in 2008. And, I don't remember, Robert, whether you were the helm already then, because it was right before Cathy Ashton came in. So it was the tail end of Javier Solana. Now, the reason that I mention it is that at the time, France held the presidency. And I happened to be the foreign minister of Finland, 4 months old in that job. But also the chairman of the OSCE. And of course, coming from Finland, when Russia attacks a country, there are quite a few ramifications. Now, what happened at that time was that the playbook of Putin, well, actually Medvedev, who was president, but, let's not kid ourselves, Putin and Lavrov, was very similar to what we're seeing now. So it starts basically with historical distortion and information war. Then it begins with the movement of troops, which gets people a little bit edgy. Then you do a couple of training exercises on the border. Then after that, you try to intimidate the other side to react. And of course, we saw different leadership between Saakashvili and Zelensky. Saakashvili was quite a lot more edgy than what we've seen Zelensky been. And then there is a declaration of the recognition of two areas. In that particular case, it was South Ossetia and Abkhazia. And then there's a movement in of security forces or peacekeepers. And I thought personally, having had that experience and then having been PM with the Crimean crisis, that Putin wouldn't go further than this in Ukraine, that he would stop with Luhansk and Donetsk. So the surprise was quite big when Thursday, a week ago at 6 o'clock in the morning, we start seeing a full invasion. And it's very easy for us to go back and say, with the wisdom of hindsight, we should have seen this, you know, the American intelligence was there, etc., etc. But it wasn't. The case was different. Now, why do I bring this then as an example? Well, the reason I bring it in as an example is what you referred to there earlier. I think for us as external observers, the most important thing is to try to muster a ceasefire as quickly as possible, because we're seeing the loss of lives now in thousands. In the Georgian case, it was in the hundreds, but we were able to get a ceasefire agreement in 5 days. And at the time, the ceasefire agreement was first crafted on the laptop of Janne Taalas, who was my advisor and happens to be now the CEO of Martti Ahtisaari's Peace Foundation. And at the first version had 6 points, just for everyone to get into the game on this. Point number 1, no recourse to the use of force, right? Do you think Putin will say that now, or Zelensky? Answer, no, because Putin will go all the way. This is his big war, it's his dirty war, and it's his big peace. Number 2, definitive cessation of hostilities. Same thing. Are we going to see that right now? I don't think so. Number 3, free access to humanitarian aid and allow the return of refugees. That could happen and that could be seen, but of course the refugees right now, we've seen 1 million go over to Ukraine. May I just add on a personal note, there's nothing scarier for a Finn than to go through 4 tank armored checkpoints with Russian military, come to the city of Gorky with a statue of Lenin in the middle, go to the back and see Russian security forces forcefully bringing out of South Ossetia and Abkhazia crying women, children, mothers, grandmothers who have been forcefully taken from their homes and planted to a certain place. Those were the disposed individuals and refugees at the time. Never forget the views on that. Number 4, Georgian military forces must withdraw their normal bases of encampment. Number 5, Russian military forces must withdraw. And then number 6, opening of international discussions and modalities. So are we at this point yet? I'm afraid we're not. And the reason that I see this crisis as being so much more serious, and as much as I rejoice Western unity, rejuvenation of NATO, unity of the EU, sanctions, etc., we're now at the point of no return. Putin cannot lose this war. And remember that dictators, unlike democratic leaders, there are 3 ways of them to leave office. One is in a coffin, one is to jail, and one is basically to exile. So that is the mentality that you have to see with Putin at the moment. What I would like to see, and I finish off with this, I would like to see someone to go in there and mediate the peace. We need a big personality. We need someone who Putin hates but trusts. And to be honest, there's only one person that I can think of at the moment, apart from the excellent job that's been done by Macron and others, but it is actually Angela Merkel. Whether we get to that stage or not, I really don't know. But these are my observations from about 1,500 kilometers away from Kiev and about 400 kilometers from St. Petersburg.
Thanks, Alex, and maybe more than 2,000 from Florence, but we could hear you very well. Now, I see already a few people on my list at least, but I would like to start with Teona. Teona is one of our policy fellows, policy leaders fellow. She's a Georgian career diplomat, and with postings in Brussels and Paris. And well, you have the floor, Teona. You probably need to raise your voice a little bit.
Thank you very much to the speakers and to Fabrizio for organizing this very timely exchange on issues that occupies us all. I would have a couple of questions to the speakers. First of all, I would like to ask you how we underestimated Russia's ambitions. You have reported Putin's recent statement, but we also know that his first very strong statement was in 2007 at the Munich Security Conference, and since when he rejected European security order, and since he matched his words with actions, war in 2008 in Georgia, as Alex mentioned, war in Ukraine in 2014, Syria and Libya. So I would like to ask you, why didn't we see this war coming? And what could be lessons learned from this? My second question would go probably to, I understand that it's a critical question about wider implications, because it certainly depends on the ways the war ends, and there are so many uncertainties around it. But there are many experts who still qualify this as a turning point, as a watershed moment in European history. I would like to ask you if you can foresee wider and long-term implications of this war on the European Union as a security actor, on the European security order, and on transatlantic relations. Thank you.
Thank you, Teona. Robert, if it's okay, I can see a few others in line. We can take a few more questions or intervention. Miroslav, I can see you have your hand up. Maybe you want to intervene now. Yes, in the corner there. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. And I'm sorry I could not be with you in Florence. Now I'm sending you my best regards from Brussels. And I really appreciate that this is now the topic of the discussion, because there is no more timely and no more urgent issue to be discussed right now. And the fact is that we were all by surprise and dismayed by what is happening now. It goes out of any mental boundaries or limits we can think of. And as Alex said, it was clear that Putin was up to something, but no one would really expect him going as far as he has been going. Well, I mean, when I was asked whether I can imagine Russia bombing Kiev, I said, no way, it will not happen. Why not? Among other things, because I know how Russia acts on international forums, and they have positioned themselves very strongly in recent years as protectors of international law. And they were always saying that the only rules that should apply are the universal rules, which is the international law. And they were building their image and credibility, particularly within the UN system, as the one who believes in international law. And this invasion is a brutal and direct violation of international law. Therefore, the vote in the General Assembly 2 days ago is a huge debacle for Russia. They have never been so humiliated. When you have 141 member states telling you that you are an aggressor, and you find yourself in a company of people like Kim Jong-un and Lukashenko and Bashar Assad, it tells a lot. And as I said, for Russia, the UN message is extremely important. Yes, I spent some years of my life in Russia, and I speak Russian, and I know that there is a very strong sentiment in Russia, the feeling that they are being encroached by NATO, that NATO is coming closer to Russia's borders and is locating its rockets closer and closer to Russia's territory, and they need to do something about it. But of course, this something must not be open aggression against your neighbor and brotherly nation. This also shows the difference between democracies and autocracy. I mean, for all of you who have watched this bizarre meeting of the so-called Russia's National Council, where Putin was humiliating the top leaders of his country one by one, not even pretending that they are consulting. It shows that how much this regime has deteriorated, and with all the faults that our democratic systems have, this would never happen in democracy. There would always be enough instances that would stop this insane endeavor. I fully agree with Alex that there is no way back for Putin, and this is what worries me. There is no clear end game. If they believe that they can install the puppet government, which I think that was their end game, this will never happen. And therefore, a dictator who is pressed against the wall can do crazy things. And this is, I think, our biggest worry, not to allow him to do crazy, including using nuclear weapons, because he will not admit a defeat, and therefore he will do anything just not to be in that position. So I put my hopes on actually on the democratic capacities of Russia itself and Russian people. And I really hope that there are some people around Putin who see that this is really leading them into a tragedy. And I, of course, with assistance from outside, and I fully agree with Alex again that Angela Merkel is probably the, yes, and President Macron, that are the two leaders who can do something about it. But my first lesson is really the democracy versus autocracy shows very clearly how important democracy is. Second, I'm honestly proud of European Union's unity, commitment, resolve, and speed of action, and I really hope it will continue like that. But you can feel the vibration here in Brussels EU institutions and with member states. Another lesson is how important it is to know and to be clear about where you belong. What are the values you believe in? These are the moments when you cannot sit at two chairs, and you cannot pretend that you can walk west and eastwards at the same time. For the EU enlargement process, it's also a clear sign that the process is based on values. It's not a technical exercise. It's a political process which is really based on values. And it's very important that we have realized this one more time. And finally, yes, this will have a long-term implications for the world global order. It's difficult. It's too early to say what exactly, but it will not be positive implications, I'm afraid. And it will, I mean, the world order has been built after the World War II is no longer valid, and we need to build a new one. So this is what I wanted to share.
Thank you, Miro, and also for making the time. I mean, you're not in Florence, but you've been in Florence enough, so you're excused. But I mean, the point I want to make before maybe giving the floor back to you, Robert, is that, of course, now we have heard some serious executive experience also on different conflicts that are perhaps of relevance for today's situation. There is also some ground experience from Georgia. I know Zach wants to intervene with the Syrian one. Maybe before that, Robert, you want to?
Well, I mean, our friend from Georgia asked the right question. How could we be so stupid? And the answer to that is. It happens all the time that we base our judgments not on our evidence but on our hopes. We're always trying to look for the good side of people, saying no, they couldn't be so horrible and so stupid and so destructive as to do these stupid, destructive things. The answer is no. You should never underestimate either stupidity or, in rare cases, or actually the possibility of cruelty and lust for power. But I wanted to say one other thing, and that is, I suspect that what Putin is afraid of is not so much NATO as Ukraine. The real risk to his regime in Russia is Ukraine, who are, after all, cousins of the Russians, turning themselves into a well-functioning democracy. That's the end of his country, the way that he sees his country. That's the second reason why we should support him. If the Ukrainians can demonstrate that people from this heritage and this background can turn themselves into a decent government. Actually, they seem to have this already. It's fantastic what we see in Ukraine today. But that is a threat to Mr. Putin's Russia. So that must be our objective. personally, it's been my objective all along.
For a long time. Thank you. So we have at least 2 questions on my list, and then so if you can please introduce yourself as well. I don't know all of you, so if you can please, Zach I know, but first Zach, and then you, and then you just in front.
Thank you, Mr. Cooper. My name is Zach. I'm originally from Syria. We've already talked. You know how I came to Europe, and when I came to Europe, Europe was welcome, at least in the first period. And then things went south, and we know what happened afterwards, especially with Belarus. Now, Fabrizio knows I was working with the European Parliament, and I was trying to work to ensure the coherence of European foreign policy between the Parliament and the Commission. I was working on how they communicate and how they interact. And I must say it wasn't very coherent, and I started asking myself, is there such a thing as a European foreign policy? But then I started reflecting on my cases. European foreign policy on Syria, how coherent on Libya, how coherent on Palestine, how coherent. And at the same time, out of nowhere, I started getting text messages from some bots in Russia telling me happy Independence Day and some very nice messages. Of course, I kept responding with Churchill quotes because why not? It's the only appropriate time to use it. And I realized that there is a combination of a misinformation campaign and an incoherence in foreign policy from the European side, and the people who are getting lost in the middle are us, the people who are fleeing these dictators, these authoritarian and sometimes totalitarian regimes to try to reach a safe place. Now, of course, I was talking to Fabrizio before, and I told him, like, yes, we left Syria. In the wave that came to Europe was in 2015 after the Russian intervention. And I was trying to say that most of the refugees that come to Europe, directly or indirectly, are caused by Russia. And I was trying to think of a concept, weapons of mass migration caused by Russia against the EU. So, of course, if you're not a foreign policy person, this is racism, you know, because you're taking in one type of refugees and not the other. And I completely, you know, see it. You know, you can look at it and I was like, well, why are the Syrians and Iraqis not welcome, but the Ukrainians are? The issue is, we are very in solidarity with our Ukrainian friends. We're working together and we're trying to make sure that they don't have the same issues that we had when we first arrived in Europe. So how, from your perspective, what do you think now in this window of opportunity, with this moment of clarity with Mr. Putin, what do you think the EU should do, at least to handle, if not have a coherent foreign policy, at least handle the misinformation?
This raises quite a number of additional questions. I belong to a school of thought in security studies, which is called the co-convened school, which essentially says that security is in the eye of the beholder. And I think what you're saying here is precisely that there is different perceptions and understandings. But the reality here, it's much more definite than that. So please, the floor is yours.
So,
No. Okay.
Thanks for this talk. I'm Nico Weber. I'm from the law department of the UI. I'm a PhD researcher there.
Can you raise your voice up?
Yes, sorry, I will raise my voice. So a lot of parallels have been drawn, and they are relevant to Georgia, for example, of course. Another parallel comes to mind, which is 2003, the Iraq war of aggression, launched on a lie, basis of a lie. A lie that only allows total victory, because of weapons of mass destruction can only take the whole country. And the same, we have a certain total logic now in Ukraine as well. So, which brings me to the point that as an international lawyer, I've been familiar with Robert Cooper's work in a different sort of framework. That's I'm not sure. So you said, you know, you don't get it right the first time. So my overall ask, I will argue that question, but the overall question is, do you walk back on what you have said in 2002 and 2003, and the role you have played in the Soviet government? Because, and that's, I just briefly outline what you have been arguing there. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, that you have divided up the world in pre-modern, modern, and postmodern states, European states, a couple of modern states, states that look like 19th century, early 20th century states, and those pre-modern states, those poor states that don't maintain a monopoly of violence. That's at least one of the criteria. Besides for the fact that I think the history of that argument is flawed, and I don't think it holds up to state-of-the-art international history. It's also clear that the argument that arises from that is double standard. You argue for a double standard, lawfulness between the postmodern, that is the European states only. And, well, preemptive strikes, lies, intimidation, whatever goes for the rest, basically. And if we talk about lawlessness, how can we not talk about, well, yeah, 2003, the endless war on terror, low-scale warfare around the world since 2001, advertised very much, and by government you have been advising. And yeah, the sort of lawlessness that arises out of that, that is not at all to relativize what happens now in Ukraine, but we can see how this is greatly facilitating Putin's propaganda. And one of these in international law, one of the outgrowths of that sort of propaganda is the unwilling and unable doctrine. So we can strike whatever country, all these pre-modern countries, because they are unwilling or unable to stop the terrorism that is originating in their country that is hitting us. So we just go over the southern tier whenever we want. And that's practical policy over the last 20 years. So that's my question to you. And then it's a bit, some things have been coming together where people have been wondering what sort of direction the SDG wants to take. Because the eve of the war, we had a podcast in which Professor Stubb was interviewed there. And I know the podcast was taken probably a couple of days earlier, but things were in the making, and at least in the eve of the war, so the day before, everybody knew, since Monday, since this speech, and I agree with your analysis of the speech, people knew things are going to blow up in some way or another. And the eve of the war, the director of the SDG publishes an interview with arguably a war criminal without asking one critical question on the war. What sort of image is that trajectory of what the EU wants as a place? Is it really just about, interviewing our political friends and having absolutely zero political engagement with what is happening? And that adds just up to not only we have now a distinguished guest lecture, but also an adjunct professor. And he's joined by Anne-Marie Slaughter, who is not really known for dovish policies, foreign policy either. So much of her public interventions in the aftermath.
But this is not about the topic of today's session.
Oh yeah, of course.
Is it?
Yeah, because how do we learn from that? Do we become a think tank for interventionist policy?
Okay, then please ask your question. Then. What is the question?
I will come to my question.
Yes, please.
Anne-Marie Slaughter is going to join, and she has been...
She has joined already. She has taught already.
That's great. So nothing against her academic credibility, but she has, of course, quite an interventionist agenda. And so my question is, is there not a clear, and that goes more to you probably,
yeah.
Is there not a too strong political bias in how you hire? And since, as far as I know, please correct me, the hiring processes of adjunct and part-time professors are not public, I haven't heard of it. But, isn't there a point in democratizing these processes and making them...
Sorry, with all due respect, we're in the middle of a war.
Yes, this is not...
So there's good. I'm happy to take this conversation somewhere else anytime. But this is quite a serious situation. So could you get to your points, please?
That's not due respect. There's no point in interrupting me.
No, but please finish that and make
raise
the question.
We are in the middle of the war, I agree, but we're not going to save Ukraine. But we're going to. I mean, there are other. I mean, I'm in favor of whatever effort we can take.
Yeah.
But this is a place where we have the ambition.
Okay, but please ask your question and then it will be answered. What is you asked your question? Is that enough? Okay, very good. Please, your turn, and then we reply.
So thank you. I'm Claudia Wiesner. I'm a visiting fellow from Germany. I'm a professor of political science and EU. I'm a professor of political science and EU integration in Germany. Okay, so I hope you can hear me.
Yeah.
And my question concerns the paradigm shift that we are just experiencing. I've been struck watching German TV last Sunday.
Yeah.
Because all the evident truths of German politics have been crumbling in pieces in hours of German. So I was just with rolling eyes like these. We see huge sums being spent to the military. We really see a paradigm shift. If you follow German Twitter, you also see sort of people really nervous about this and what is happening. And I'm not wondering only about Germany, but also about Europe, because the second paradigm shift that I'm experiencing is that the European Union, ! Buys weapons for Ukraine. So who would have thought any of these would have been possible 2 weeks ago? No one, including, I think, most of all of us. So my first question really is, what is the consequence for the European Union? Are we going to see a geopolitical European Union? Are we going to see a European Union army? Are we going to see a closer cooperation of the EU and NATO? And my second question, I think, actually, I guess it goes back to what Alexander Stubb said in his contribution. You mentioned Angela Merkel, and I sort of gathered that apparently it will really be trouble to offer Putin a way out of the situation. And this is also what I wonder about. So maybe you could elaborate a bit more on what could be the, not face-saving, but what could be a possible way out of the situation?
Oh, this is actually a long question. Do you want to take that first, and then I'll try to answer you, and then of course there's also Zach's question.
Shorter than the previous question.
Yes, shorter than the previous.
To answer the second question first, I agree with you. I mean, not only is the Germany we're looking at today different from the Germany of yesterday, very radically different by the look of it. I hope not too radically, actually, because I like the other Germany too. Maybe somehow combining the two would be better than going all out. And I would say the same about the European Union. I've personally always been skeptical about the European army, because the European army, if you're running an army, you need to have a chain of command in which there is one person in charge of it. And it doesn't work with 27. And you have to abandon consensus to do that. So I don't think I think that this is probably a blip, and a very well chosen blip, rather than a trend. That's my guess, but I might be wrong. And with Germany as well, I must say that I'm very happy to see Germany having a higher defense budget. I'm very happy to see Germany ready to supply weapons to a country to a friendly, peaceful neighbor under attack. But I hope that the fundamental values of the Federal Republic will survive because they are admirable. Can I just say one word to the previous, very short, and that is to say, just to put the record straight, I did give Tony Blair advice on military intervention at one stage. This was the intervention in Macedonia. You may or may not have heard of it, because the war didn't take place. And the reason the war didn't take place was at least partly because of the military intervention. That was the objective. I was not there when Iraq happened. I was very happy not to be there. I understand why he took the decision. God knows what I would have done if I'd been in his position. But I was very happy that I had no responsibility for that at all. I was off to the EU, which you'll be very happy to hear, had zero policy on the question of Iraq, because they never ever discussed it. Whether that was a big success for the EU, I'm not so sure, but it was more comfortable than the domestic. I would say, apart from that, I think it's unfortunate for Tony Blair, well, unfortunately, sort of understatement that he made that decision. Take that away, he was really one of the best managers. But the rest gets forgotten.
Thank you. I'll try to answer actually also your question, because I happen to have worked in Berlin for 5 years, so I have some thoughts about that as well. On your question, I would be happy to maybe have a cup of coffee later, and I can tell you about our hiring procedures and practices. I don't think this is the time or the place. We have gathered here to discuss. People have signed up to discuss something else. That being said, and just to go for the record, just rest assured that and I've been around since the school started. Rest assured that diversity of opinion is really at the heart of the way we do our hirings and actually conduct our activities. And the fact that you've heard views from Georgia, Syria, should be a testament to that. A couple of days ago, we had something on inclusive leadership on our gender track. We have been hosting a forum on democratic participation with NGOs from all over Europe for over a year. So take my word for it. We have diversity of opinion. Point number two, for a school of public policy that is worthy of its name, we have to engage with policymakers. We have to, and we have to do that critically. Robert has been speaking about mistakes. He has been delivering a lecture on the Balkans the other day, speaking about the predicament of that process and the difficulties of that process. I think we wouldn't be fulfilling our mission if we did not critically engage policymakers. So, my humble opinion, you are barking at the wrong tree. But other than that, let's have a cup of coffee and we can discuss it further. Coming back to the topic of the question on Germany, I feel also that for a number of years we had. I once wrote a column entitled "A Tale of Two Germanies," and that's not, of course, East and West, but it's this perception that for the longest time after the Cold War, Germany was almost a sort of the Switzerland in the middle of Europe, right? And that has translated in positions that seemed immutable and, more importantly, based on public opinion. I think the seismic shift and paradigm shift that you describe is as much in the decision making that was, apparently very sudden, and from what I could read, not even consulted. I mean, as far as we know, the Chancellor effectively took that decision almost on its own, perhaps consulting only the finance minister for making sure that there was the money in the coffer in the first place. But other than that, what is interesting is to see how this is actually translated in a public opinion shift in Germany, which is perhaps just as surprising to onlookers. So that's sort of my 2 cents on that.
But I want to say again, actually, I admire the old Germany as well. And let's have both.
All right, Andrew.
Can I quote you out of place when you said I like the old Germany?
Thank you for the lecture. I'm Andrew, I do migration policy mostly. My question is similar to Frank Oswald's question from the chat, when he asks, how does the war affect the global south? Noting in the UN vote 2 days ago that there's 141 nations that voted for the resolution condemning Russian aggression in Ukraine. That's an increase of, if I remember right, almost 40 countries from the 2014 resolution on Crimea, which is a sizable increase in the history of the UN. That said, notably, there was still, well, Eritrea, of course, voted no, and 17 abstentions of African nations from this resolution, and I find that 17 notable. How do we see then this conflict and the violation of the UN Charter in terms of respect for territorial integrity affecting geopolitics in sort of larger European neighborhood, especially in Africa?
And it's maybe worth mentioning the fine speech from the permanent representative of Kenya, or Kenya, I'm not sure how you pronounce it. Actually, I was brought up there, so I ought to know how to pronounce it. I think Kenya is probably correct. Of course, everybody, whenever they look at any situation in the world, the first thing you think about is your own country. And if there is some kind of analogy with your dispute with your neighbor, then that affects the way in which you vote. So the reasons for which people vote for and against, there's sometimes nothing to do with the subject that's actually on the agenda. And probably you have to look at them one by one to understand, or it's something about the coalition or something like that.
I think, Alex, you wanted to intervene again, perhaps, if that's a good time for you.
Sure, yeah. I mean, a lot of good comments and a lot of good questions. If I could try to dissect a couple of them, you know, in a telegraphic form. The first question came from, you know, probably someone who has experienced war in Georgia. In other words, you know, how and why did we underestimate Putin? Why didn't we see the situation with after his speech in Munich in 2007? I think it's a good question. You know, after the war in Georgia, I gave a speech which is called 080808. And in that I predicted that there had been a shift in European security because we saw military intervention and spheres of interest on the borders of Europe for the first time again. I also then said that, you know, this will have implications to the whole security political structure. But it wasn't something, remember after Georgia, what happened was that Lehman Brothers came right away. So we sort of, everything sort of got washed away to a certain extent. But I think we've now seen that Putin uses military force and aggression. He did it in 2008, did it in 2014, and now he's gone all the way in 2022. So instead of going to the hindsight, I think we need to, you know, do that analysis, but we should focus on the current. And that's why your sort of second question was very pertinent. You know, how will this war end? You know, is this a watershed and long term? Okay, so here comes the analysis from the discussions that I've had the opportunity to have with you know, military personnel, political leadership around in this region. Putin has three demands. Demand number one, Ukraine and recognize Crimea. Demand number two, push back NATO from the Russian border, which basically means push away Eastern and Central European countries from NATO. And demand number three, do not allow Finland and Sweden to join NATO. We also know that Putin right now is in a state where he's completely off limits of what he will be able to use. So therefore we think up here that we're preparing for the worst possible scenario. There's a lot of talk about NATO membership. I have always been an advocate myself, but I think right now is not the time. As we speak, President of Finland, well, hopefully is sleeping, but is about to meet President Biden in Washington, D.C. And I'm sure there will be a conversation about security guarantees, et cetera, because we are a frontline country to Russia, 1,300 kilometers of border. Our airspace and Swedish airspace was actually violated yesterday with 4 MiGs, which is unheard of. They've been violations before, but not that far. What's the end game? What's the long term? I think what's going to happen is that there will be a sort of a new Iron Curtain, which to a certain extent is good news and bad news. It's an Iron Curtain where we don't know where it's going to end, but we're going to have an authoritarian, as Miro said, Russia, and then we're going to have an alliance of democracies, which basically means all of Eastern and Central Europe. And I think we'll start seeing a move, as we have already seen with EU membership applications from Georgia, from Ukraine. We're going to have to address the issue in Moldova, et cetera, et cetera. So there will be a split. So security is back with a force. The final point I want to say on that is that there's, however, one card that Russia doesn't have anymore in a world where everything has been weaponized. They do not have anymore the economical and financial instrument of warfare. Yes, a little bit still in energy, but they cannot, use that as they will. So they only have one card left, and that's the military. And this is, of course, where things start getting a little bit scary. My final answer to the questions, and then I'll address what Nico raised. Is there a paradigm shift? The EU only acts in crisis. And the example that I always give is from the recent times. On the financial and euro crisis, it took 4 years to set up the European Stability Mechanism, right? Banking union and the rest of it. In the COVID crisis, it took 4 months to establish the biggest financial rescue package in European history, including the mutualization of debt, and actually through the European Commission rather than the European Investment Bank. And now it took 4 days, in my mind, in the security crisis for the European Union to start pushing the idea of becoming a true defense and security union. So in that sense, as I've kept on saying in a lot of the international media interviews, in 7 days, Putin achieved everything that he really did not want to achieve. The Europeanization of Ukraine, it wasn't about NATO, it was about their values. The unification of the European Union, the revitalization of the transatlantic relationship, the rejuvenation of NATO, and the probable NATO applications of Finland and Sweden. And then to address Nico's question, Nico, I'll be more than happy to sit down, and I'm sorry that I'm here in Finland. I'll up Fabrizio. He was talking about coffee. I'll go out for a beer with you, because the questions that you raise are relevant. I can tell you from my personal perspective, in politics, when you are in a position of power and responsibility, and sorry for using strong language, with the wisdom of hindsight, you quite often screw up, right? So you make mistakes. And quite often what happens is when you make those mistakes, you don't necessarily realize when they happen, you realize it afterwards. What I've always felt in my life, and having been 8 years in government, and believe me, I've met the monsters of this world, right? So I've had 2 meetings with Assad. I was face to face with the now fortunately dead president of Uzbekistan, Karimov. It's just, you're trying to get into the mind of that person, and you're trying to of course change them, but usually it's quite difficult. Sergei Lavrov, I'll give you one mistake. I've taken a picture with Sergei Lavrov in 2018, in Belarus, in Minsk, when I was at the EIB negotiating a package with Lukashenko. And so, the things that you do in your political life where you really fuck up, right? So, sorry for the language. But the difference there is that I always believe that no matter what kind of mistakes you've done, you need to have the channels open. With Putin, I don't think there is anyone who has the channels open at the moment. With Lavrov, I know that there are a few people who have the channels open. Then on the issues of podcasts and hirings and things like that, I think it's very important that we understand that we are a policy school. What we want to do is to bring together people who've had experience on the ground, and then people who have a sense of what academic analysis and concepts means. And we'll continue to do that. And we try to give our students the best of both worlds. And the choices that we make are, I can guarantee you, they have nothing to do with ideology. We're trying to find the best people available on the market. And for instance, at the end of this month, we'll have Bengt Holmström, who has a Nobel Prize in economics and many others. But as I said, Nico, I think, in the name of academic freedom, in the name of conversation, I think I'm more than happy to talk to you about the lines that we take and the people that we choose. On the podcast, don't worry, we're going to have about 100 people. Some of them we agree with, others we don't. Sorry for the long answer.
Okay, there's a lot of people in line now. Let's start with those that cannot speak because somehow they are far away, both virtually and geographically. So I'll just read out the question, and then I know that there are a few in line also in the room. So the question is from Didem from Istanbul, and it is from the European perspective, what kind of Turkish response does Europe need? Does Turkey's timid alliance, due to its economic situation and anti-Western stance, timid alliance with Europe and NATO, will it be enough in the near future? And when the EU enlargement debate has started once again very vividly, what about the EU's Turkey policy? Do you see any possibility for any change in it? That's question number one. Question number two from Frank. Does the Global South have a role to play in calming/fueling the war? How does the war affect the global? This is along the lines of what Andrew was asking. How does the war affect the Global South? What does colonial and historical transgressions against Africa? Probably it's your brother, I don't know. What does a colonial and historical transgression have in common with this Russia-Ukraine war? That's a bit of a broad question. If you want to give it a few thoughts, and I can maybe open up for the room, or you want to answer right away?
I can answer the Global South question. That's too big for me.
Right.
The Turkey question, I can say that I was involved with Turkey around about 2002, about 20 years ago. And that was a really hopeful time. Can we get back to that? And the answer is, if Turkey gets back to where it was around that time, then yes, we can get back to that. Life's full of second chances. I wanted to make one other remark, and that is, among the different bosses that I dealt with, the thing that I admired very much about Cathy Ashton was her intense interest in people, that she regarded her ability to get on with people who everybody else found impossible, because she found them fascinating. She somehow found people so interesting that the question of whether she liked them or not wasn't relevant. She liked to find out more about them, try to understand them. And that's a really, it's a really difficult approach, but I think actually it's a great approach for a diplomat. Don't try to make judgments about people, just try to understand them.
Thank you. All right, Joe. Yeah. And then you. Yeah.
Okay. So, my name is Miroslav, complicated maybe one. Jaros from Poland. I'm the policy leader fellow. So just some comments, and also comments to what Teona said. So you have the Georgian perspective, now we will have kind of the Polish perspective. So just let me tell you, so there is not something like a good side of Putin, I'm afraid, I need to tell it. And it's just someone who gets, the assassination of the journalist for a birthday present. So you remember probably Anna Politkovska, exactly on the 7th of October, 2006. So it's not a person just to sit one table, have a coffee, have a beer. I'm sorry, it's impossible. Maybe I'm getting emotional now, thinking about what's happening in my country, also what was happening in Georgia. And just 2 or 3 comments and some questions. First of all, so this transnational governmental factor that I was working with, I was working in Ukraine as a European expert for the judicial reform. And I've met people, they were really seeing Europe as something that they deserve, that they really have. That's the country that had the revolution of dignity, so the year 2014. So these are not, the phrase that we repeat all the time, but they are really doing it. And they really deserve all the help, all the support that they are having. So that's the first thing. Second point, and now because it's sometimes it goes like a sinusoid to be a Pole, like you are sometimes very proud. Like there's a solidarity movement in the 80s, then there's accession to European Union, then there are hard times starting in 2015 maybe, and then I'm proud again with the solidarity, with the hospitality, with the generosity of my country. But I'm also scared, and it's also to what Alex said, because we will probably see another Iron Curtain. So it's my question to you. How do you see, how do you maybe not design, because I will be very happy if no one will design another Iron Curtain again, but how it can look like, how it can affect also the European policy, the position of our part of Europe, with Poland being again kind of a very strong player. I hope so. And then just last but not least, I will try to use the diplomatic language. So we have some issues with rule of law still in Poland. But yeah, okay, with all due respect, and I'm a lawyer, so how we can, like, I don't know, connect or just I know what's most important. Most important is the situation that we are having now. But how can we, connect the dots for just think about it? That's something that I'm still thinking about. So thanks a lot.
Thanks so much. And the Polish perspective is indeed very, very relevant these days. Please.
My name is Fabrizio. I'm Romanian. I'm a member of the European University Institute. Long time ago, I defended my thesis here in the history department. Now I'm working with different American universities here, teaching European history and political economy of the European Union, and also collaborating on a small center for the study of Eastern Europe in general. So I have a few points. I'm trying to be very, very brief. First of all, the fact that we have so many treaties, including the one that was signed by Russia recently after Ukrainian independence, let's say that borders are not going to be touched. So history is full of treaties that were signed and violated soon after. Let's take some signed by Germany and Russia before the Second World War, non-aggression pact, but soon after, September 28, 1939, the Friendship Treaty, so more hypocrisy even in the name of the treaty. So that is, it shouldn't be an excuse for us to underestimate the potential of a conflict there. Second, what you said about the summit in Bucharest, right? And when this offer, sort of very vague offer, was made to Ukraine, so definitely that we talk about stupidity, right? But whether it was more than stupidity there, because whether it wasn't something like not enough attention, not enough care for Ukraine, right? So not considering, right, the implications of that, and probably related to that, and what my colleague said, definitely also the further implications, not only for Ukraine, but also for countries like Romania and Poland that are right now, right, the border of NATO, and all of the weapons are going there. And I know, so we can make a very clear distinction in Romania between the period before, when some people were proud, even secretly proud, that with this small Romania are in NATO, so Russia will never touch us. And today, when they see the possibility of war, that they many things, maybe also the good idea to transform us. This is the opinion, the public opinion in Romania, what people are telling me. And the last point, actually not the last, another point is the candidacy of Ukraine, right? This invitation, another offer, right? I wonder about the opportunity of such an offer in this moment. And then Moldova, right? Also. And I wonder, it's also a matter of coherence, no? Why Bosnia is still out? And you mentioned Turkey earlier, which is the reaction from Turkey that is waiting there, right? Join this European Union. So, I mean, for me, it was not a good moment, no? To come to such an offer. And probably the last point is a sort of invitation to look back to the history of the 20th century, Ukrainian-Russian relationship, because we talk about different aspects and we say this is a war, no, between brothers, but we also know that the various crimes are taking place in Hungary. So, and there were things, just considering the civil war, right, 1919 to 1921, and which was the role of Ukraine at the beginning of the civil war, and not to talk about the more recent, right, Holodomor, right, and the famine in Ukraine at the end of the 1920s and the beginning of the 1930s. So those things are there and probably are going to surface again, unfortunately, right now. Thank you.
Thank you. There is probably Teona wants to speak, but before we take a round of questions or answers, if you have any. I have any answers. If you have any answers.
That has been terrific. I was listening to what the lady here was saying. I was thinking to myself, I wrote down timing. What is a good idea one day or 1 year is a bad idea the next day. And it goes with timing, it goes with personalities, it goes with the international environment. The same words can mean something quite different in another year. The same idea can mean something quite different. So you need to consider not just what you're talking about, but the environment around it as well. Everything is more complicated than you could ever dream of when you start. That's in a way what you have. That's what transnational governance is supposed to be about. Trying to understand all of the angles. But you mustn't let that stop you from doing something, because if you think too long, sometimes you just have to take a jump. I've been wanting to say for some time, so, because I'm always feel slightly anxious when I hear Alex say something about getting rid of Finnish neutrality, because I think of Finnish neutrality as an art, as a work of art, so carefully constructed and so carefully handled. And I think it's an example to everyone of how to conduct yourself in a difficult world.
Just two quick answers from me, and then I know there are some more questions. We have time, so don't worry. On the Global South question from Andrew and online from Frank, of course I'm not either the best place to answer. In fact, it's a pity that we do have people at the school that could answer that question and should perhaps answer that question. Some of our professors from working on the Africa program, for example. I know that Mehari, who is our Africa program director, has been really, he's from Ethiopia, and he has been really, for him it's probably heart-wrenching to hear talks about genocide while in his own country something very real is taking place. I do want to, however, mention something about this, is that part of the way the school work is that we have so-called networking groups. I'm not going to get into the details, but the point is to mix different categories of students, fellows. It so happens that my networking group is completely of non-Europe. It was not by design, but there's no European in my networking group. They are all from actually largely what you would call the Global South. And The anecdotal reference there is that in our last meeting, we discussed a statement that was published by President Xi and President Putin just at the beginning of the Beijing Olympics. I meant to send it to you, but you know what? It's actually on the Kremlin website, which now is down, so I couldn't send it. But the point is, so this statement is quite striking at a number of levels, not least that they speak about democracy and what they define as democracy. And, you know, I had expected that conversation to go along the lines of double standards. But to my surprise, the group was actually supportive. And they were saying, hey, we have to hedge our bets. If this is what they mean, then we have to listen to them. I would like to have that conversation again now. This was at the beginning of the Beijing Olympics. And I would actually like to have that same conversation now and hear if there is any difference. One last point on one of your questions on the EU membership issue, which was also raised online. Some of us who worked in Brussels in the mid of the past decade argued for a long time that the question of membership is of course controversial for a number of reasons: absorption capacity and the complexity of the process and the Balkans as well. But one thing that policymakers in Brussels could consider, and should have considered all along, is a statement along the lines of recognizing those European aspirations according to Article 49 of the Treaty of the European Union. Nothing more than that. That doesn't require an opening of the negotiation, but of recognizing the aspirations. That has not been done, really.
That is fine. I'm Romanian.
Yeah.
The fact that Moldova, that was part of Romania, no? Recently disappeared. I'm happy, but I'm also scared that Moldova may end actually on the other side.
Yeah, of course.
No, that was my question about the opportunity, the time.
Thank you. All right, many questions, and let's try to, you were first, yes? And then Leona, and then the two of you. Yeah.
Morning. Lisa Lumak, Migration Policy Center here at the European University Institute. But before coming here, I was a lecturer in IR theory in my native Buenos Aires, and where I used to teach the one that teaches Lajcák. So it's a pleasure to meet you in person. So I wanted to ask you about inflexible positions. So, because what we are seeing is that both Russian and Ukrainian positions are becoming increasingly flexible. And this has been the case in the last few years, at least what we can see or read. And now there's this enormous debate within IR theories, with Mersheimer in the middle of all this, you know, sending messages to one and the other on whether Russia's positions and concerns over their security were legitimate or not, and the fact that this is great power politics and this is the way in which great powers behave. The point is, well, and Russians and the Russian leadership, maybe if we don't agree with Mersheimer's point, they seem to be, those concerns seem to be real for them right now. And there's a lot of talking right now of Putin and Putin's psychology and what he really thinks, and that we don't know, and we can't really guess, but his perception seems to be very much in line with Mersheimer's decision. They have even posted someone in social media, Russia, you know, something official from Russia.
The foreign ministry, I think. It was the Russian foreign ministry.
Yeah, and one question is, does Putin really believe what he's really saying? We don't know, but maybe he does believe that there are Nazis in Ukraine and this is about, you know, and if he really believes it, and his position becomes increasingly inflexible. Also, Ukraine's position is understandably inflexible. They don't want to lose territory, they don't want to lose their sovereignty, they don't want to stop being an independent country. And the diplomatic work is to try to find points of agreement or to make them up. Which are the perspectives to find points of agreement in such an inflexible scenario? What's the role that Macron, as an intermediator, can play or is playing right now? How do you say it? And there are talks that Lavrov is currently being isolated within. I read something. The voices of Lavrov, because he's being considered one of the ghosts. So there are talks that he may be kind of isolated within the leadership. Is this true? How do you say it?
Thank you. Okay, there are very many interventions in line. I would ask you to please be brief, especially you, Teona, since you spoke before, if you can be very brief, and then there are maybe 5 or 6 interventions in line. Yes.
Thank you, Fabrizio. I would like to make a comment that resonates a bit with the previous question. We are speaking about NATO enlargement, NATO promise given in Bucharest in 2008. But I would like also to recall that in 2014, during the first Russian war in Ukraine, Ukraine was not so enthusiastic about NATO enlargement. So it was in 2008 that Ukraine and Georgia were expecting a membership action plan. Instead, we got this promise that one day, without timeline, without framework, we would become. And I would also emphasize that since 2008 until 2021, nothing has changed because of the position of some member states, and it's not a secret, and leadership change, but positions are there. That I would like to say that from 2008 to 2021, for Russia, it should have been clear that there was not imminent threat, NATO threat coming, and a threat of Georgia and Ukraine becoming members of NATO. And probably I would have a question also that actually also coincides with what you have raised, is when discussing about the turbulence of Russian foreign policy. So there are some who claim that this is structural, so this is international balance of power that explain Russian foreign policy. Others, it's mainly strategic culture, no matter within the Kremlin, the Tsar or Communist Party Secretary Generals or KGB agent. So Russian foreign policy is very consistent. And in addition, I read recently Michael Macron's article in this former ambassador to Russia, who was raising this aspect which relates to Putin, his ideas, and decision-making that he established. So within this range of factors, which one would you consider helpful to explain Russian foreign policy?
Thank you. Teona, would you mind if we take a couple more questions? Robert? Would it be okay with you? I take a couple more questions.
Yes, why not?
All right, then there's you, and then Kapusin. Yeah.
Hello, my name is Boško Stankovski. I'm policy leader fellow here at the SDG, and I'm from North Macedonia. So in line what Sir Robert said about the intervention in North Macedonia, I can say that it was a very successful example of EU involvement in crisis management, and a very successful example of coordination that existed between the EU, US, various institutions, NATO, the OSCE, and so my question, coming from the region, is what is, in your view, the effect of the war on the Balkans, which is always considered the powder cake of Europe, and we see and there is very strong sentiment, pro-Russian sentiment among particular leaders in the Balkans. A few days ago, it was announced that Milorad Dodik had a call with Lavrov. It was not disclosed what was the topic of discussion, just that having a talk is alarming enough. 3 days ago, just in the aftermath of the intervention, also asked for NATO membership. NATO yesterday said that it's probably not the right time. It was a process that involves including consensus by the member state. So, in addition to the effect that it might have on the Balkans, we now talk about the EU now is currently a bit of tapping itself on the back well, how all now there is Ukraine wants to become a member, Georgia wants to become a member, but let's not forget, I mean, there are 2 countries currently that have in several consecutive reports by the European Commission that they have fulfilled the conditions for starting the negotiation process, and that is North Macedonia and Albania, and yet they haven't opened the negotiation process as of today. I mean, my country had a big, I mean, it was all over the headlines with the PRESPA agreement resolving the name. It was certainly a very huge step, and it could have created an impetus only to have been vetoed even a year after. So in addition to the effect on the crisis is how the EU can keep its credibility. It cannot sort the situation in the Western Balkans, which is not even its backyard, it's part of the living room. Thank you.
Thank you so much. All right, let's take a round of...
The last question is extremely easy. I couldn't agree more, is all I can say. I absolutely, entirely agree with you. And there's unfinished business there. And it's doing no good. And we really need to do this. My view of the European Union had always been that it may be that the recent developments will change that. But my view of the European Union was always that its ambition should not be to be a great power in the traditional sense. Its ambition ought to be a power which became great by inclusion, by creating a system rather than by beating people up. And for me, the big success of the European Union was 2002, the Eastern Enlargement. And actually I said to one or other American colleagues, if you want to see regime change, come to Europe. And it's not done with the military. And that's what I still believe, that the EU's goal ought to be ever wider system, actually. It's in a sense, I think that this is the opposite view of power, because it's not really power, but it's a power of inclusion. It's the opposite view from the sort of Mearsheimer, I never pronounce his name correctly, Thucydides view of history, in which is the war of all against all. There is an alternative, and it's called the European Union. Or you can call it the postmodern if you want to, but look, the publisher said to me, please call it postmodern because that will sell. So there you go. All right, Capucine, and then you, yes. And then there is Umar as well. Get ready, Umar. I've seen you.
Okay, so thank you very much. My name is Capucine. I'm a master student here. And so my question will be very short. First of all, you talked about China, and I wanted to build on that. Do you think it's possible that China will get involved in this conflict, and to what extent, and how should we react? And I have maybe a little theory about that, so that's why maybe we can discuss it. We know that China has some interest, a lot of economic interest in Africa. And we know that a lot of Western countries are involved currently in Africa, especially in Sahel. I personally live in France because I'm French. And we know also that now French is kind of contested, if I may say, in Mali, and that instead a lot of Malian civil society are asking for Russian involvement. So they are talking about, obviously, Wagner, but also just calling Russia to fight terrorism. Is it possible that we will see maybe a sort of asymmetric war in this region, meaning direct affrontment, confrontation, military confrontation between the Western forces, military forces, and either China or Russia? I think more about Russia than China, but we never know. Yeah.
Thank you, Capucine. Yes, sorry for keep you waiting.
Thank you. I'm Raluca Radu. I'm a fellow here at STS and a professor of journalism at the University of Bucharest in Romania. So I'm just going to speak from my perspective. as a journalist trainer. I think that what is happening now in the EU is coming also as a pressure from the general public, and then EU has such a strong response as it went so quickly because media went kind of in the same direction and the public opinion went in the same direction. And we are now working a little bit with social representations that are created here and are created also in Russia. And my question is, what do we want on the long term? Because on the one hand, everybody is waiting for the normal Russian person to stand up and do something. And on the other hand, we are talking about, I don't know, a new iron curtain. And we are talking about us versus them. And just to give one example, course on Dostoevsky that was withdrawn and then was put back again in the curricula in Milan is an example of what is going to develop in the end if we don't take care with this discourse, us versus them, and on the long term it's not going to work very well, isn't it?
That's a very good question. I have a comment on that, but first, thank you. Umar, it's your turn now, and it's also for you. Sorry for waiting.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak to the audience, and thank you to our guest today.
Introduce yourself, Umar, for those who don't know.
I am Umar Kabanda from Uganda, and I'm a policy leadership fellow within the Transnational School of Governance. And my focus is on global peace generally, and looking at the United Nations Security Council, we come to realize that the veto members are 5. We have Russia, we have China, we have the United Kingdom, we have the US and France. Now, looking at Ukraine and Russia, we are seeing one of the veto powers, Russia, participating in a war. And on the other side, looking at the NATO, we are seeing other veto members on the other side. So the big debate is on why then within the Security Council, Peace Security Council, why couldn't they be able to anticipate some of these challenges in terms of moderating global peace? And the main question to our guest is, do you think the Ukraine-Russia war informs some of the reforms that are needed within the Peace and Security Council? And what will manifest out of not doing these reforms is seeing China attacking Taiwan. We'll continue to see Africa being challenged with civil wars, having ideological concepts from Russia, which is right now in Ukraine, and the West. So do you think the Security Council learns from this situation? And how can this situation inform the actual practical regulation of peace and security across the world? Thank you so much for the insights, and we are really learning a lot from you.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Umar. Are there other questions? Because otherwise we will do a last round of answers, and then we try to wrap it up. Yes?
I have a question, maybe a bit in line with your question. Yeah, I'm Andre. I'm from the border region of Italy and Austria. So we're very happy that we have the EU because it was bringing down the border between our regions. But anyway, my question is, if we look at what's happening in Russia, might it not be more insightful if you look at the philosophy behind the regime there? I would think about Dugin and Heidegger-inspired philosophy behind there, and this grand idea of Eurasia and the fight against the liberalism. Would that not be a better frame than the classical IR theories? That's my question.
All right. Thank you.
Wow, well, that last question blew my mind.
Blew your mind.
I did once try to read Heidegger, and it really didn't work. I didn't
German?
didn't understand a word of it. So I hope that the answer is not Heidegger. And I'm willing to bet that Mr. Putin, actually Mr. Putin, when he gets serious, he gets really serious about things. And maybe he has read Heidegger. Maybe that's the answer. I just don't know for that. What my writing said it was read. The China question. China's been rather silent on this subject so far. I'm sure that China is observing everything, thinking about everything, thinking about it, how it affects China, of course. And you can say China has a big investment in Ukraine, as actually it does, but it's got big investments everywhere. And it's got a big investment in its relationship with Russia. I think I can say honestly, I haven't got a clue what China is thinking about this. But I'm sure that they're looking, I'm sure that Taiwan is probably high up on the list of things that they're asking themselves, does this mean we need to look at Taiwan from another angle? But exactly what they're seeing, I haven't a clue at the moment. But look, there are lots of clever people here from all over the world. I bet somebody else knows better than I do. The question about the Security Council and vetoes, there's a perennial question about whether the Security Council structure should be changed. Clearly, this is a structure that was invented in an entirely different world. And it's almost only an accident that China is in the Security Council. But in a logical world, there would be a seat for the European Union rather than for Britain and France. But if you want to get yourself to be Prime Minister in Britain or President in France, you don't go around saying, I'm going to give up my seat on the Security Council. What really happens with those bits of institutions, it's the Constitution, they're very difficult to change because they have a veto. Is Russia really the person you should place global security in Russia's hands at the moment? The answer is we've got no choice. That's what it says. What happens is institutions like that don't change. They get superseded by something else. Maybe that will happen at some point. Who knows? It could even be the result of this. But you need a really big catastrophe to do that. After all, World War II, end of UN, but end of the League of Nations, and the UN takes over with a slightly different constitution. But you also get what really happens after World War II is you have a large number of other institutions as well grow up at the same time, and somehow, the UN's got its problems, but it's a great survivor. It's still there, and it's still relevant. And you still resolution. Curiously, the General Assembly maybe is going to end up one day being more important than the Security Council. Maybe that's the way in which you solve the problem of the veto. People will take more note of what happens in the General Assembly. This General Assembly Resolution 141 is a very powerful thing, and the people who voted for it matter. I don't think that would be a bad direction to go in. Maybe there should be a movement among countries to give more space to the General Assembly. missed out a whole lot of other questions, partly because my
Handwriting.
well, partly because of my handwriting, partly because you can't really listen and write at the same time.
It's multitasking. But I do have a 2 cents on your question about the us versus them, because it strikes me that, well, postmodern means different things to different people, but when it comes to identity building processes, and especially in Europe, it's always been argued that, and this is really the postmodern line, that Europe's, we have replaced the us versus them with the argument that Europe has distanced itself from its own past. So the past is the other. That has been the argument for a long time. Now, you could make the case, and this is really a very primordial 2 cents analysis, that in a way, this conflict has made the us versus them dynamic relevant again, and we needed to coalesce around a other, namely Mr. Putin's Russia, in order to make some things happen. So you could even tentatively say that the postmodern Europe that, yes, was the things that you said about peace in Europe, but it was also about fuzzy borders and fuzzy arrangements at the periphery. Well, that may not work anymore, and you need a neo-modern, perhaps, Europe in some respects to address some of those questions that are being raised. But it is
what I was writing about then. It's not. And I don't think it's irrelevant, and I think it is still relevant. Is essentially that this is the post-imperial age. This was 100 years ago. Everything was empires. Either you owned an empire or you were part of somebody else's empire. Well, that's disappearing. It's almost gone, and that's why what we're seeing here. Is essentially an attempt to reconstruct an empire, and that's out of sync with the time. Maybe it will happen, but if it does, it will be temporary. And so the question, the way I was trying to answer then is, if we don't have empire, then what do we have? How is the world going to be organized? And I think that's still a good question. I don't think that it's yet been answered. And therefore, the future's open. The next generation can decide that question.
Well, this brings our session to a close. And certainly, this is not an intent. I have no desire and ability to summarize it, but I sometimes and often come back to one phrase that actually is in the book that has been quoted so many times, which is that, and I think there you're paraphrasing Jean Monnet, if I remember rightly, that when there is a problem that you cannot solve, enlarge the context.
Yes.
Yeah, enlarge the context. And I mean, if anything, I think, on my count, we have had interventions today from Georgia, Romania, Poland, North Macedonia, Uganda, Turkey, Argentina. We have tried to enlarge the context, and what is happening is boggling the mind, and it's, I think it's affecting all of us. So I don't think we aim to give definitive answers, but certainly we have had a conversation which at least for me was very enriching.
Am I allowed to make one last remark?
Sure.
What I really loved about working in the European Union, and anybody who has a chance, I really recommend it, is until then I worked for the British government. You go into a meeting in the Foreign Office, you can predict within the range of this what everybody is going to say. You go into a meeting with a new crisis, someone has invaded, somebody's government has collapsed, something like that. You go into a meeting in the European Union, you have no idea what everybody's going to say. Everybody comes from a different culture, different history, different background. You have a far greater range of ideas and choice. And therefore you have far more many options. And all I can say is, as a bureaucrat, that's really fun. And I think but I also think it's healthy, because nationally we get stuck in one way of thinking. And I fear that that's a problem in Russia, actually. That Russia needs to be opened up a bit.
All right, thank you all for coming. To be continued, I guess.
Yeah, I will send you an email. I have to catch the. Do you know my plan?